The city of Varanasi was awake before dawn. Streets usually quiet at sunrise were now swept clean and adorned with garlands, flags, and long banners bearing symbols of Hindu devotion. The occasion was rare. Not just a festival, but an international Hindu spiritual gathering that hadn't occurred in decades. From distant lands, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Thailand, even African and American Hindu communities, priests, pilgrims, and spiritual leaders had come. And they hadn't come alone. Each priest brought with him a cow. But not just any cow. These animals were sacred, hand-selected, raised and adorned for months, treated with reverence and spiritual devotion. Some were bathed daily in rose water, others fed only with mountain herbs. Their horns glistened with golden paint, their backs draped in red and saffron velvet. Necklaces made of jasmine, bells tied with silk, anklets made from silver beads. They were more than animals. They were symbols of purity, mothers of creation, living embodiments of divine blessings. By mid-morning, the roads were teeming. Journalists with press badges jostled for camera angles. Drones hovered above to capture the once-in-a-lifetime spectacle. Children sat on shoulders. Old men leaned on sticks, craning their necks to glimpse the divine parade. The mayor gave a proud speech. Varanasi, he declared, is honored today, not by gold, not by politics, but by the footsteps of Dharma echoing in our streets. As he spoke, senior priests chanted Sanskrit hymns, releasing plumes of incense smoke that drifted over the crowd like a veil of mysticism. The procession began. Rows of priests in orange and white marched forward with calm dignity. Beside them, their cows walked slowly, almost meditatively, the bells on their necks jingling rhythmically. Devotees tossed flower petals, bowed in respect, or chanted from roadside platforms. For a city that was often noisy with traffic and vendors, Varanasi that day felt like an ancient holy script come to life. Among the lead priests was Pandit Mahadevan, a towering figure in the Hindu religious world. With decades of rituals and teachings behind him, he was known for his stern discipline and spiritual charisma. The cow walking beside him, an enormous white bull with golden painted horns, had been raised at his temple for 5 years. To him, this was not just an animal. It was an extension of his soul. Everything seemed perfect. But as the procession moved deeper into the old city, past ancient temples, over cobblestone alleys, and near monuments that had stood for centuries, the air shifted. The sun, once gentle and golden, began to pierce down more sharply. The wind changed direction. There was a subtle tension. A murmur passed through the crowd, not loud enough to cause alarm, but enough to make the sensitive pause. Then it happened. One of the cows, a brown one with jasmine flowers braided into its tail, stopped abruptly. Its eyes widened. Its ears twitched. It sniffed the air with unusual urgency. The priest holding its rope pulled gently, whispering mantras. The cow didn't move. Instead, it began to stomp. Once. Then again. Louder. Its bell clanged violently. The priest tightened his grip, but the cow let out a deep growl and jerked away. Spectators gasped. Seconds later, another cow turned sharply, breaking its formation. Then another. And another. Panic spread like wildfire. Bulls and cows that had just walked with the serenity of saints were now crashing into altars, toppling offering tables, smashing fruit baskets, and scattering garlands. Statues of deities trembled as animals butted against them. One marble idol cracked at the neck and fell, its pieces scattering like bones across the stones. Screams erupted. Cameras fell. Children were lifted into arms. Priests were yelling, begging the cows to calm down. Some tried to recite louder mantras. Others beat drums. But nothing worked. Pandit Mahadevan's own bull, the pride of his temple, tore the velvet cloth off its back and rammed into a brass chariot, splintering it like paper. It was no longer a parade. It was chaos. Police rushed in but hesitated. Who could predict where the next cow would strike? They weren't attacking people, but they were merciless toward the sacred items of the event. Offerings were trampled. Temples were damaged. And the most confusing part? It seemed intentional. Not random. Mahadevan was in shock. Never in his life had he seen cows, holy, obedient animals, go berserk in a sacred event. His eyes followed his own bull as it pushed past the wall and stood still, breathing heavily. But then something strange began to happen. As suddenly as the madness had begun, it started to fade. One cow, then another, lifted its head. They turned. All of them. Their ears twitched. Their tails dropped. The crowd fell into a hush, eyes following the same path. The cows were looking towards something. No one could see it yet, but then came a sound. Soft. Calm. Floating above the smoke and the dust. It wasn't a bell. It wasn't a mantra. It wasn't a chant from the procession. It was Quranic recitation. From somewhere nearby, the sound of a man reciting the Qur'an echoed gently across the alleyways. No microphone. No speakers. But it was there. Audible. Smooth. Beautiful. The verses flowed like water over stone. And the cows responded. One by one, they began walking slowly, not randomly, not wildly, but in formation, toward the sound. Some priests dropped their ropes stunned. Others held on and were dragged gently. No one understood what was happening. The animals that had just destroyed sacred altars were now walking like devotees toward a single direction. A narrow street. A stone arch. A small white building. A mosque. Old. Simple. Tucked away between two spice shops. Its doors were open. Inside, an old man sat cross-legged on a prayer mat, reciting Qur'an in a low, steady voice. His eyes were closed. He was unaware of the chaos that had unfolded in the city. But outside, everyone was watching as dozens of sacred cows walked to the threshold, and stopped. They didn't enter. They didn't move. They just stood still, facing the Qur'an. Like they understood. Like they were listening. The street in front of the mosque had become a sacred scene. Not because of the gold, not because of rituals or ceremonies, but because of the stillness that gripped even the air itself. The cows, dozens of them, stood in a solemn row, facing the entrance of the mosque. Their heads slightly bowed, their bodies calm. Their tails no longer flicked with irritation. The fury that had erupted moments ago was gone. The Quranic recitation continued inside. The voice, aged, steady, gentle, floated out into the streets like a divine breeze. Those who had been running in fear moments earlier now froze in place. Even the priests, known for their unwavering belief in their own traditions, stood like statues, watching what felt like a miracle unfold. The man inside the mosque had not yet emerged. He had no idea that his voice had caused an entire city to fall silent, or that cows who moments ago tore down temples were now listening with the reverence of seekers. Pundit Mahadevan stepped forward slowly. His white robe was dusted with the ash from the broken altar his cow had shattered. He looked at his bull, once the pride of his spiritual journey, now completely still, ears perked toward the sound of the Qur'an. Mahadevan's hands trembled as he reached for the rope, but the cow did not flinch. It did not acknowledge him. It was as if something greater than any human authority had taken hold. Behind him, a murmur rose among the other priests. Pandit Rajendra, a respected figure from central India, broke the silence. "What is happening?" he whispered. "Why aren't they moving?" Another priest replied in a hushed voice. "They're listening." The words struck deeper than anyone expected. Listening. To what? To verses from a book they had spent a lifetime ignoring, or worse, opposing. The Qur'an was not part of their scripture, nor was the mosque a place they ever entered. Yet something strange, undeniable, had occurred. These animals, raised in ritual and tradition, had not bowed before idols or followed mantras, but they had stopped, entirely, when the Qur'an was heard. Kareem, the mosque's muezzin, stepped into the scene. A local man, quiet and humble, he had been watching from the back of the alleyway. He now walked cautiously toward the mosque door. His heart pounded. He didn't understand what was happening either, but the sight before him was unlike anything he had ever seen. He gently entered the mosque and approached the imam. The old man looked up from the Qur'an. There's something happening outside, Karim said softly. The Imam furrowed his brow. What do you mean? Please come and see. The Imam stood, carefully placed the Qur'an on its wooden stand, and walked toward the door. As he stepped out, his eyes widened. There in front of him stood dozens of cows, silent, calm, almost meditative. What is this? He muttered, his voice nearly caught in his throat. Behind the cows, the priests stood in lines. Some looked stunned. Some whispered prayers in their own languages. Some simply looked lost. The Imam's voice cracked as he said, Allahu Akbar, not in pride but in awe. Not long after, one of the younger priests attempted to pull his cow away gently. The animal refused to budge. He tried again, tugging with both hands, but the cow dug its hooves into the ground and let out a soft grunt. Then something even more shocking happened. The cow turned its head and placed itself between the priest and the mosque door. Protectively. Like a guardian. Like it knew that what was inside needed to be preserved. That was when the crowd lost its voice completely. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was reverence. Something in their souls knew they were witnessing more than just a moment. It was a message. A message from the animals. A message from God. A few residents began filming quietly with their phones. One video captured the moment the cow blocked its priest from stepping too close. Another showed an old woman in tears, whispering, I've lived here 60 years. I've never seen anything like this. The Imam, unsure of what else to do, simply returned to his prayer mat and began reciting again. This time, louder. Not for performance, but because the silence outside had become so thick, so powerful, that his voice naturally filled it. Surah Ar-Rahman, the Most Merciful, his favorite chapter. As he read the famous repeated verse, Which of the favors of your Lord will you deny? The cows twitched their ears, and remained perfectly still. One little boy, about 7 years old, walked out from behind the mosque. He was barefoot, holding a small glass of water. He approached the nearest cow, the same one that had shattered a statue just half an hour earlier. Without fear, the child placed the water gently before the animal. The cow lowered its head, not to drink, but to nudge the glass closer to the boy. Then it lifted its head again and resumed its listening posture. The boy smiled and walked back. Even the priests couldn't hide their emotions now. Pandit Mahadevan whispered to Rajendra, This is no coincidence. I know, Rajendra replied. But how do we explain this? There's nothing to explain. You saw what I saw. You felt what I felt. Tears shimmered in Mahadevan's eyes. They did not bow to idols. But they stood before the Qur'an. Not long after, news of the incident began to spread across the city. Local news channels sent reporters. Aerial footage showed the strange formation of cows in front of the mosque. Anchors stumbled over their words trying to describe the peaceful scene after the violent stampede. Scholars called in to speculate on animal behavior. But no scientific explanation fit the pattern. Back at the mosque, Karim noticed something else. Every time the Imam paused between verses, the cows shifted restlessly. When he resumed, they quieted again. It was as if the Qur'an wasn't just sound, it was connection. The cows were responding not as animals, but as witnesses. Pandit Rajendra finally walked up to the mosque door. Not in confrontation. Not in arrogance. But with humility. He asked quietly, May I enter? Karim looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. This house of worship is open to all who seek truth. Rajendra removed his sandals. His feet trembled as he stepped inside. He sat in a corner, cross-legged, silent. Listening. Behind him, Mahadevan and 2 other priests followed. For the next hour, no words were exchanged. Only verses. Only silence. Only the whisper of something beyond this world moving through the hearts of men and animals alike. By the 3rd hour of stillness, it was no longer just a gathering. It had become something sacred. The sun had begun its slow descent across the Varanasi skyline, casting warm golden hues over the narrow streets. Dust particles floated like fireflies in the air. The Qur'an still echoed softly from inside the mosque. The cows remained motionless, their posture unshaken, still facing the open door as if in deep reflection. The crowd had swelled. People stood on rooftops, leaned out of windows, or clustered at alley entrances, careful not to disturb the inexplicable serenity of the moment. Television reporters whispered into microphones, unsure how to explain what they were witnessing without sounding ridiculous. "This is no longer about religion," whispered one young journalist. "This is about something bigger." Inside the mosque, the Imam, Abdul Malik, continued his recitation. Each verse he read seemed to ripple outward. Outside, it passed through ears and entered hearts. Among the stunned observers stood Professor Hakes, a researcher in animal behavior from Delhi University. He had only arrived a day earlier for the event, intending to study ritual bonding between humans and sacred animals. But what he was witnessing now went far beyond scientific observation. He pulled out a small notepad and scribbled rapidly. "They're not reacting to a frequency," he murmured. "They're responding to a state of being." He looked up. "It's like they're in worship." He approached one of the cows cautiously, running basic stimuli tests, waving a cloth, clicking fingers. No response. But when the recitation paused for breath, the cows stirred. When the Qur'an resumed, they stilled once again. He wasn't the only one noticing the pattern. Inside the mosque, Pundit Rajendra sat with eyes closed. He didn't understand Arabic, but he felt the words. Their weight, their rhythm, their resonance. It wasn't noise, it was peace. "I don't know what's being said," he whispered, "but I feel like my soul does." Imam Abdul Malik glanced at the faces of his visitors. The lines of tension that had marked them earlier were softening. These weren't the same priests who had marched in rigid formation that morning. These were men quietly unraveling inside. Back outside, something even more remarkable began to happen. Families from nearby Muslim neighborhoods began trickling into the street. Some brought bottles of water for the bystanders. Others quietly placed straw mats under the cows to make them more comfortable. Still others simply stood with their hands folded in awe. They were not showing off. They were not preaching. They were just serving. Even a group of young boys who usually kicked footballs through the alleys had now sat in a line, watching in hushed reverence. One of them whispered, "I used to be scared of those cows. Look at them now." On the other side, the Hindu priests were having quiet discussions among themselves. "Should we leave?" "No," said Mahadevan, his voice distant. "I think we are supposed to stay." "But what if people say we are betraying our tradition?" Mahadevan turned slowly to him. "What tradition teaches you to ignore truth when it's in front of your eyes?" No one answered. For the first time in years, the priest had no sermons to deliver, no mantras to chant, no control over what was happening. And yet they didn't feel powerless. They felt free. Disarmed. Human. A gentle breeze moved through the street as the call to Maghrib prayer approached. The Imam's voice lifted, announcing the prayer, and as the final note rang out, the cows gently sat down, all at once. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. A synchrony no one could explain. Gasps rippled through the crowd. An old Hindu woman nearby began crying softly. She had come to the festival with her grandchildren. Her name was Savitri, and she had lived her whole life worshipping cows. But never had she seen them act like this. She reached out and touched the head of the cow closest to her. It looked at her with calm eyes and blinked slowly. That one blink brought tears to hers. "Maybe," she whispered, "they know something we don't." After the Maghrib prayer, Imam Abdul Malik stepped out of the mosque. He looked over the crowd and the animals still resting in front of his door. There were thousands now, humans and cows, sharing the same space in peace. He raised his hand, not in command but in invitation. "My brothers," he said, "and my sisters, and all those whom God created, today is not about winning nor losing. Today is not about Hindu or Muslim, about rituals or customs. It is about witnessing something we cannot fully explain, but we can all feel. These animals, they do not speak our languages. They do not understand our politics. They only know truth when they hear it. He paused. And they have heard it. There was no cheering. No applause. Only tears. Silence. Eyes locked on each other. Nods that carried more weight than any chant ever could. Pundit Mahadevan stepped forward. I have read 1,000 texts in my lifetime, he said slowly. But I never imagined that an animal would teach me to listen. He looked back at his bull, still seated unmoving. I don't know what happens next. But I know I can't walk away unchanged. He turned to Imam Abdul Malik. Would you allow us to return tomorrow? Just to sit? To listen? The Imam nodded with a faint smile. This mosque has no walls against sincerity. You are welcome. From that moment forward, the city changed. No decree was passed. No official statement was made. But the people knew. Something had shifted. A new chapter had opened. Children began asking their parents questions they never thought they would. Old shopkeepers, once wary of their Muslim neighbors, now shared bread at dusk. And the cows, those gentle creatures once believed to be sacred for one group, were now symbols of something greater. They had led the city back to stillness. That night, the news spread like wildfire. Cows halt religious parade, bow before Qur'an recitation. It trended across social media. News anchors debated it. Atheists mocked. Believers defended. Skeptics analyzed. But those who had been there didn't speak much. Because there are moments so profound that explanation becomes disrespectful. They simply carried it inside their hearts like a hidden flame. The next morning, Faranasi woke up to a silence that felt sacred. The city that had expected chants, drums, and temple processions was instead filled with the soft murmur of curiosity and reverence. The cows had not moved. They were still sitting outside the mosque, calm, alert, and unmoving. A few had laid their heads on the ground. Others rested but kept their ears pointed forward, as if waiting for something. That something came at dawn. As the early light filtered through the city, the voice of Imam Abdul Malik rose again from within the mosque. The sound of the Qur'an floated through the air, smooth and steady, like ripples on water. The cows, in perfect response, gently raised their heads and turned toward the sound. It was no longer a spectacle. It had become a rhythm. People began to gather again. Locals, pilgrims, reporters, priests. They came not for explanations, but simply to witness. The previous day's chaos had been replaced with an odd harmony, between people who had never before shared space without tension. And in the middle of it all, the cows stood like bridges between hearts. Inside the mosque, Imam Abdul Malik sat quietly after Fajr prayer. The warmth of the prayer mat beneath him, the softness of the recitation still lingering in the walls, he remained in deep thought. He was not thinking about cameras or headlines. He was wondering what it all meant. Was this a miracle? A sign? A trial? That's when he heard a knock. Kareem, the mosque's muezzin, peeked in. Imam Saab. Pundit Mahadevan is here. The Imam nodded. Bring him in. The old Hindu priest stepped in, more humble today than ever before. His forehead carried wrinkles of wisdom, but also lines of doubt and quiet surrender. He took off his shoes at the door and walked softly across the carpet. They sat facing each other, two men of God, raised in different traditions, but now united by a mystery that neither could ignore. Mahadevan was the first to speak. I've seen many strange things in my life, Imam Sahib. But nothing like this. The Imam smiled gently. Nor have I. Mahadevan looked down. The bull that sits outside. I raised him since he was a calf. Fed him with my own hands. Bathed him in sacred water. He responded to every mantra. Every call. But now, he doesn't hear me anymore. He only listens when you speak. There was no accusation in his tone. Only grief. The Imam leaned forward slightly. Maybe it's not about me. Or you. Maybe it's the words. The words of God, they reach where our voices cannot. Mahadevan nodded slowly, almost painfully. I thought I understood the divine. I thought I had him contained in my books, my rituals, my ceremonies. But then, an animal I considered sacred taught me that truth doesn't bow to tradition. It bows to the source. A silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. The Imam finally said, "Would you like to read the translation?" Mahadivan's eyes lifted. "Of the Qur'an?" The Imam nodded. "In Hindi. Or English. Whichever brings clarity. You don't have to believe. Just listen." Mahadivan paused, then smiled faintly. "Listening, it seems, is how all this began." Kareem brought out a translation copy, worn, soft-paged, bookmarked. Mahadivan took it like it was made of glass. He did not open it immediately. He placed it in his lap with respect. He needed a moment. Meanwhile, outside, another group of priests arrived, ones who hadn't been there the day before. Their expressions were skeptical at first. But when they saw the cows still motionless, still facing the mosque, something shifted. Slowly, they walked to the side of the crowd, said nothing, and just watched. Some residents brought water again. One elderly Muslim man brought hay and gently laid it before the cows. One of the priests noticed and asked, "Why do you care for them like that? Aren't they our symbols?" The old man smiled, brushing dust from his shawl. "They listen to the Qur'an. That makes them our brothers." The priest stared at him. "But you don't even eat beef anymore?" The old man laughed. "There are more ways to honor a creature than by making it sacred or forbidden. Sometimes we just love them because they remind us of God." On the rooftops, more people arrived. Some came from nearby cities. Others traveled through the night from far-off towns. They had heard the viral clips, seen the pictures, the cows, the silence, the unbroken listening. Now they needed to feel it for themselves. That afternoon, a spontaneous gathering began near the mosque. Without planning, without invitations, without banners. People from all backgrounds, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, even some curious foreigners, sat in a wide circle. In the center stood no stage, only a table with books, the Qur'an, the Gita, the Bible. No microphones. No debates. Just questions. One student stood up and asked, "What do we do when God speaks through animals but our hearts are still stubborn?" An old woman answered gently, "We listen. And when listening is not enough, we change." A child raised her hand. "Are the cows Muslim now?" The circle burst into laughter, kind, not mocking. Someone replied, "Maybe they're not Muslim. But they're certainly believers." Later, Pundit Mahadivan stood to speak. "I've been a religious man all my life. But it was an animal who showed me what surrender looks like. Not to me. Not to a temple. But to God. And I won't lie to you, I don't know everything. I don't know what will happen tomorrow. But I know that if you feel peace in a place, you must not fear it." That evening, Imam Abdul Malik led another open recitation outside the mosque. This time, he was joined by priests. They didn't chant. They didn't argue. They just sat beside him. Some with prayer beads. Some with silent tears. And once again, the cows remained. Like guards of peace. Like witnesses. Like believers. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the night breeze stirred through the city, the entire community shared a silence that felt more powerful than the loudest sermon. It was the silence of realization. That maybe, all along, God was trying to speak, but no one was listening. Until now. By the fifth day, Varanasi had become something it had never been before, a city not divided by religion, but united in a shared stillness. The news had spread not only across India but across the world. The photos of sacred cows resting peacefully in front of a mosque had gone viral, igniting debates in parliament halls, curiosity in seminaries, and even admiration in places where religion was usually ridiculed. But in Varanasi itself, people were no longer interested in opinions from afar. They were living the story. The cows remained at the mosque gates, unshaken, unmoved, as if rooted by some unseen force. Not even heavy rain during the night had disturbed them. Local residents, both Muslim and Hindu, had built makeshift shelters around the animals. Some brought them garlands. Others cleaned the space daily. Children now walked barefoot around the mosque, whispering to each other, "This is where God touched the animals." But something new had begun. The priests were changing. Not publicly, not with grand announcements or dramatic renunciations, but quietly, internally, like a tide slowly turning in the ocean. Pandit Rajendra had not left the mosque since he first entered it. He now spent his evenings sitting on the carpeted floor, reading a Hindi translation of the Qur'an. His disciple, a young man named Arjun, sat beside him, often asking questions he never would have dared before. "Guruji," Arjun asked one evening, "are we allowed to learn from another scripture?" Rajendra closed the book slowly. "If the cows weren't afraid to listen, who are we to be afraid?" Meanwhile, Imam Abdul Malik continued his routine, never trying to convert, never debating, only reciting. His voice had become the heartbeat of the city, a sound everyone, from fruit sellers to journalists, recognized instantly. One night, just after Isha prayer, a group of high-profile Hindu scholars arrived quietly. They didn't speak to the crowd. They simply stood near the cows, observed the situation, and then asked if they could meet the Imam. Inside the mosque, the discussion was short, but powerful. One of the scholars, Pandit Raghav, known for his conservative stance, spoke gently. "I've spent decades defending my tradition. But I have never seen animals, whom we consider sacred, react this way. I must admit, it has shaken me." Imam Abdul Malik didn't smile triumphantly. He only nodded with humility. "Truth does not compete. It only waits. And when hearts are ready, it enters without force." The pundit placed his hand on his chest. "I do not claim to understand what is happening here. But I can no longer ignore it." That night, for the first time, he joined the recitation. Not as a cleric. Not as a rival. But as a listener. Out in the courtyard, a Muslim boy approached a Hindu girl and offered her a cup of water. She accepted it without hesitation. Down the street, an elderly Sikh man sat with a Christian missionary, both watching the cows and whispering about what it all meant. The city had become a living scripture, each person a verse, each glance a translation. But while most celebrated the peace, not everyone was ready. In a nearby district, voices of dissent began to grow. Some political figures called it an emotional manipulation. Others claimed it was a foreign plot to destabilize Hinduism. News anchors demanded answers. Social media was flooded with hashtags like #CowMiracle, #Quran Effect, and even #Divine Conspiracy. But those who had been present? They didn't care for trending hashtags. They had witnessed something that didn't fit in 280 characters. On the sixth morning, something changed. As the city stirred from its sleep, a loud rumble echoed through the streets. People rushed out. And what they saw stunned them again. The cows were moving. But not chaotically. Not in rage. They rose, slowly, gently, and began walking. But not away from the mosque. They were walking, deeper into the city. Crowds formed, following them like pilgrims. Children ran alongside, women peeked from behind doors, and the priests, both Hindu and Muslim, walked in silence behind them. Step by step, the cows led the crowd past homes, alleys, and into the very heart of Varanasi, the square where a ruined temple stood. It had been partly destroyed during the original chaos days earlier. Now, the cows circled it. Then they stopped. They stood in stillness again. And something extraordinary happened. One of the priests, a younger man named Devanand, stepped forward. He was known for his fiery speeches and strict enforcement of tradition. But today, there was no fire in his voice. He looked at the crowd and said, "We came to show our strength. But it is the animals who showed us surrender. And this is not a site of destruction. It is now a place of reflection." He turned toward the cows. "If they can forgive, why can't we?" From the back, a woman shouted, "But what do we do now?" And that's when Imam Abdul Malik, standing beside Pandit Mahadevan, said the words that would define the future of the city. We build again. Not a temple. Not a mosque. But trust. The crowd stood in stunned silence. It wasn't about bricks or domes anymore. It was about what had happened inside them all. In the days that followed, something even more beautiful began. People began to visit both the mosque and the damaged temple, not to argue, not to prove anything, but simply to sit in silence and reflect. Some brought flowers. Some brought scriptures. Some brought nothing but their questions. And every evening, like clockwork, the cows returned to the mosque. As if that had become their sanctuary. Journalists continued to ask questions. Scientists brought equipment. But the animals defied all logic. They were not influenced by any known frequency. They responded only to the Qur'an, and only to the voice of Abdul Malik. One foreign reporter asked him during an interview, "Do you think this is a miracle?" He smiled faintly. "I think it's mercy." And then he said a line that would be quoted in headlines across the world. "Sometimes the animals remind us of our humanity." The seventh day dawned over Varanasi with an unusual quiet. Not the silence of tension, but the calm that follows deep reflection, like the hush of dawn after a storm has passed. The people of the city awoke with something stirring in their hearts. Something they couldn't name, but could feel. The cows still stood in front of the mosque. Even after everything, they had not left. 7 days had passed since the procession had turned to chaos. 7 days since statues had fallen, since bells had been silenced, and since sacred animals had bowed, not before idols, but before a voice reciting the Qur'an. 7 days since the unexpected had shaken the city awake. That morning, people from every corner of the country were arriving in Varanasi. Not for pilgrimage, but for peace. Buses, trains, vans, filled with curious travelers, scholars, skeptics, and believers. Not all came with good intentions. Some came to challenge. Others to investigate. But by nightfall, most found themselves sitting quietly near the mosque, side by side with strangers, their questions fading beneath the weight of what they were witnessing. What they saw was no performance. No orchestrated event. It was simply cows, peaceful, unmoved, sitting before the mosque like monks before a mountain. No one had trained them. No one had lured them. And yet, they returned every day at the same time. Only when the Qur'an was recited. That evening, the mosque courtyard filled again, not only with Muslims, but with priests, pilgrims, farmers, students, tourists, and families from every background. A large speaker had been set up, not for drama, but so that those sitting far in the back could also hear the words being read. Imam Abdul Malik stepped forward. His voice, though humble, had become iconic. His calm delivery had somehow melted tension across generations and castes. That night, he opened the Qur'an and began reciting Surah al-Baqarah, the cow. The irony was not lost on anyone. Verse after verse flowed through the air. This is the book about which there is no doubt, a guidance for those conscious of Allah. The crowd listened. And the cows, still as ever. Some blinked slowly. Some rested their heads on the ground. A few had even begun softly mooing, not with distress, but like they were humming along. Then it happened. A priest, Pandit Ravindra, one of the oldest and most respected voices in the region, stood up. He had not spoken in public since the incident began. He had listened, watched, prayed in silence. But now, he walked to the center of the courtyard. People turned. The cows didn't. They continued listening. Ravindra folded his hands and bowed slightly, not in the Hindu style, not in imitation, but in a gesture of reverence to the moment. Then he said, "I came here to lead. But I ended up being led." He pointed toward the cows. "I raised them to follow mantras, rituals, and symbols. But they ignored all that when they heard a voice speaking something that my soul, though proud, recognized as truth." Gasps rippled through the crowd. He turned to Imam Abdul Malik. "I am not here to convert. I am not here to rebel. But I am here to say that what I have heard over these days, I cannot unhear. And I do not wish to." Tears shimmered in his eyes. "And if a cow, born without doctrine, without scriptures, can recognize the divine in words we once feared, then what excuse do we, with all our intelligence, have to remain blind? A hushed stillness fell over the audience. Then came a slow, spontaneous movement. One by one, other priests stood. Some walked toward the mosque and sat in the front rows. Others remained in the back, hands over their hearts. Not in submission, but in humility. And just then, one of the oldest cows, the white bull belonging to Pandit Mahadevan, stood and walked forward. It didn't stop at the mosque door. It entered. For a moment, no one breathed. Inside, it walked to the corner, near where the Imam had placed his Qur'an. It knelt. And it stayed. Even skeptics who had refused to acknowledge the mystery of the past weeks sat in stunned silence. A few openly wept. And then, something even more powerful happened. A woman stood. Savitri, the elderly Hindu grandmother who had wept on day one, lifted her hand and said, "We were waiting for a miracle. But the miracle was waiting for us." The people turned toward her. She continued, "We have spent lifetimes defining ourselves by what separates us. Language, clothes, religion. But these cows have no language, no religion. And yet they found the same peace we all crave." From that moment, something irreversible began to take root in Varanasi. In the following days, interfaith gatherings became routine, not to argue, but to understand. Youth from all backgrounds visited both mosques and temples, sitting in silent circles to listen to scripture from different faiths. The damaged temple was not rebuilt in stone, but in relationships. Hindu priests and Muslim scholars collaborated to turn it into a shared peace center, where anyone could come, sit, read, reflect, and pray, no matter what name they called God. International media declared it a spiritual revolution. World leaders sent delegations to study the event. Animal behaviorists published papers. Scientists wrote articles. But the locals knew the truth. It had nothing to do with frequency, or sound waves, or rituals. It had to do with truth. And truth doesn't knock. It enters. If the heart is ready. In the weeks that followed, many cows were released into protected fields near the mosque. But they often returned, walking from miles away, just to sit again and listen. Their presence became a silent symbol, not just of faith, but of remembrance. Remembrance that God speaks in many ways. Through scripture. Through silence. Through even the lowest creature on earth. One evening, a tourist asked Imam Abdul Malik, "What do you think God wanted to say through all this?" The Imam thought for a long time. Then he looked at the cows, the children playing between them, the priest sitting under the minaret with Qur'an in hand, and he smiled. "I think God wanted to remind us that sometimes those without tongues listen better than those with speeches. And when they listen, the world changes." And it had. Varanasi was no longer just a city of temples. It had become a city of hearts. And its heartbeat was the sound of peace. A peace carried on the back of humble cows. And the verses of a timeless book. On a clear autumn morning in Sichuan, China, the air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and the sky stretched in a calm blue over the famous Leshan giant Buddha, a 71-meter-tall stone statue carved into a cliffside, overlooking the confluence of 3 rivers. Tourists flocked to the heritage site, cameras in hand, marveling at the serenity etched into the statue's ancient features. What none of them knew was that beneath this still face lay a secret buried for over a millennium, one that would shake the spiritual and political foundations of nations. Dr. Li Jun, a seasoned Chinese archaeologist, was leading a routine conservation study along with his research team from the National Cultural Heritage Administration. The team was tasked with conducting non-invasive structural analysis of the statue using 3D mapping and ground-penetrating radar. It was supposed to be standard procedure. But fate had a different plan. As they scanned the torso area of the statue, an area that had always been assumed to be solid rock, the instruments began to behave strangely. Echoes returned inconsistently. Hollow chambers? Unlikely. The Buddha statue was carved into solid stone, and no ancient documentation had ever mentioned any internal construction. Dr. Li ordered a focus scan. What they found stunned everyone. A large cavity, almost 5 meters in diameter, was discovered deep inside the belly of the statue. It wasn't a simple hollow space. The cavity had what appeared to be distinct layers, stone platforms, sediment layers, and possible human interference. Immediately, work was halted, and officials were informed. Within hours, the area was sealed off from the public, and military guards were discreetly stationed nearby. The Chinese government responded quickly. While initially downplaying the incident to the media, internally, a high-level task force was formed under the direct oversight of President Xi Jinping himself. The president, who was known for his strict stance on ideological control and religious neutrality, saw the discovery as both a potential treasure and a potential threat. Dr. Li's team was granted clearance to proceed with an internal expedition into the Buddha statue. As the outer layer was carefully drilled open and stabilized, they entered the hollow. What awaited them inside was beyond imagination. The chamber was surprisingly well preserved. The air was dry, likely sealed for centuries. Dust floated like ancient spirits in the narrow beams of flashlight. Stone carvings lined the walls, unlike anything in Buddhist tradition. Strange, curving symbols, geometric shapes, and in the center, an altar-like structure. Lying on top of it was a wooden chest, nearly fossilized. With trembling hands, Dr. Li opened the chest. Inside were brittle parchment scrolls, bronze artifacts, and something utterly shocking, a string of prayer beads. They were unmistakable. Misbah, the Islamic rosary. Intricately carved, and on the largest bead, the word Subhanallah was etched in classical Arabic. Gasps echoed in the chamber. Arabic? Whispered one of the assistants. How is this possible? It didn't stop there. On the walls of the chamber, faint inscriptions began to emerge as they shone ultraviolet lights. Arabic calligraphy. Verses, some incomplete, some intact. Among them, a name, Muhammad, written with reverence. Another name stood out. Zulkifli. Dr. Li stared in disbelief. Prophet Zulkifli? That name, revered in Islamic scripture, was not known in Buddhism. What was it doing inside one of China's most sacred Buddhist monuments? When the news reached Beijing, President Xi was briefed in a closed meeting. The implications were enormous. If this information leaked, it could provoke theological shockwaves across the country, and possibly the world. Was the statue always Buddhist? Could it have been reappropriated from another religious culture? How did Islamic artifacts end up sealed within it? President Xi's first reaction was to contain the story. No leaks. Absolute discretion. We cannot allow confusion among the people, he said. But curiosity had already begun to stir in the archaeological world. Whispers of a historical anomaly at the Leshan Buddha reached academic circles abroad. The government knew they couldn't hide it forever. Xi Jinping made a bold move. He ordered the formation of a multinational research committee under the guise of cultural exchange and interfaith heritage exploration. This way, China could maintain control while appearing open-minded on the world stage. Dr. Li and his team were now joined by experts from Iran, Turkey, Malaysia, Egypt, and even France and Japan. Linguists, theologians, archaeologists, and historians all converged in Leshan to study the artifacts. The room inside the statue was now being called the Hidden Chamber of Unity. The initial consensus among experts was that the artifacts were authentic and ancient, likely over 1,000 years old. Radiocarbon dating of the parchment pointed to a period between the 8th and 10th centuries CE. The misbah, made of sandalwood and polished with age, was unlike any Chinese artifact ever discovered. The Arabic inscriptions raised eyebrows across disciplines. Some were clearly religious phrases, Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, Bismillah. One sentence referenced the servant of Allah, Zulkifli. Another fragment hinted at the messenger Muhammad, peace be upon him. This couldn't be a coincidence. Muslim scholars began proposing a controversial but fascinating theory, that the figure long believed to be the Buddha represented in this statue might actually have connections to Prophet Zulkifli, known in Abrahamic traditions as a pious and patient man, sent to guide his people. Some even speculated that Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, and Zulkifli may have been conflated over centuries through oral tradition, trade route exchanges, and cultural evolution. The academic community was split. Some dismissed the theory as revisionist fantasy. Others found it worthy of serious inquiry, especially in light of the artifact's authenticity. The debate intensified as media outlets got wind of the story and began publishing speculative headlines. Arabic found in ancient Buddha statue. Could Buddha have been a prophet? Islamic symbols in heart of Buddhist icon, what does it mean? President Xi could no longer remain silent. He addressed the nation in a special broadcast. China has always respected its rich historical heritage. The Leshan Buddha remains a symbol of cultural unity. This new discovery invites us not to fear, but to explore. We must approach it not with division, but with dialogue. His speech was met with mixed reactions. Conservative Buddhists in China expressed deep concern. Muslims around the world celebrated it as a miraculous sign. International leaders began calling for transparency. And so, what began as a quiet morning of routine inspection had evolved into a global reckoning. What was once carved in stone as a symbol of Buddhist serenity now whispered ancient truths in Arabic, echoing questions about identity, history, and belief across the world. In the days that followed the shocking discovery within the Leshan giant Buddha, the site became one of the most closely guarded places in all of China. The area was quietly closed off to tourists under the guise of conservation work. But aerial surveillance photos leaked online showed armed military presence, and cranes being moved into place. Satellite imagery sparked speculation, and online forums exploded with wild theories, everything from secret tunnels to UFOs. But the truth was even more fascinating, and far more consequential. Inside the statue's newly discovered chamber, the International Committee worked tirelessly under Dr. Li's supervision. Armed with high-resolution scanners and translation software, the team began meticulously decoding the Arabic inscriptions carved into the chamber's walls. One inscription sent chills through the room. Wa Zulkifli kana mina sabirin, and Zulkifli was among the patient. It was a direct quotation from the Qur'an. A Malaysian scholar named Dr. Hafiz Idris, holding back emotion, whispered, "This is not just archaeological. This is Quranic." His voice trembled as he pointed at the verse reference carved in Kufic script. No one could explain how such a verse came to exist inside a Buddhist icon built centuries before Islam officially reached China, or so they thought. The committee made a list of all the anomalies. Misbaha, Islamic prayer beads, with Subhanallah engraved. Arabic calligraphy citing Zulkifli and Prophet Muhammad, pduh. Ancient manuscripts containing both philosophical meditations and religious supplications in mixed languages. A crude but clear carving of a man in a robe with his palms raised in dua, a Muslim gesture of prayer. The most astounding discovery came when they analyzed the statue's head. Using thermal imaging, the scientists found embedded inscriptions beneath layers of oxidized stone. When cleaned and digitally enhanced, one sentence glowed like fire. La ilaha illallah. There is no deity but Allah. The room fell into stunned silence. Even Dr. Li, a man of science, had to pause. "This is no ordinary monument," he murmured. "This is a message buried in time." Outside, however, the situation was getting more complicated. News of the discovery had begun leaking into the international press. A documentary filmmaker from Al Jazeera somehow obtained a short drone clip of the statue's internal layout. Headlines began to appear across the world. Islamic relics found inside China's sacred Buddha. Prophet Zulkifli linked to Leshan monument, scholars divided. Xi Jinping orders global interfaith dialogue amidst religious shockwaves. In China, the reaction was deeply divided. Young Muslims felt empowered. Many took to Weibo, China's version of Twitter, using coded language to discuss the light inside the stone. But Buddhist communities were shaken. Monks from Mount Ummah, a nearby sacred Buddhist site, held emergency gatherings. One senior monk publicly stated, "Buddha's image cannot be altered by historical errors or confusion. This is dangerous." President Xi Jinping found himself navigating a crisis that touched not only on faith, but on the identity of an entire civilization. In a closed-door session with China's Central Committee, he expressed both concern and intrigue. "If this finding is true," he said, "it will not destroy us. It will define us." To balance internal pressure and global curiosity, Xi Jinping proposed an unprecedented move, a live broadcasted interfaith symposium. Scholars from all major religions would discuss the discovery, live from Beijing. The theme? Truth, tolerance, and time. The announcement was met with overwhelming international interest. Muslim-majority nations sent delegations. The Vatican expressed cautious curiosity. Buddhist leaders from Thailand, Sri Lanka, and Japan agreed to join. A respected sheikh from Morocco called the discovery a whisper from history that Allah is one. While preparations were being made, something else was quietly happening. In Lesan, despite security protocols, a handful of images leaked from inside the statue. One photo showed the Arabic word Zulkifli, glowing under UV light. Another captured the misbah placed on the altar. These images went viral across the Muslim world. In Jakarta, Cairo, Istanbul, and Lahore, people held vigils. Some wept. Others raised their hands in prayer. "Ya Allah, show us the truth," they chanted. In Indonesia, a group of Muslim youth started a hashtag that trended worldwide, #TruthInLeshan. The committee, meanwhile, began piecing together the possibility that the statue was never originally built as a Buddhist figure. A Turkish historian suggested that it might have been repurposed during the Tang dynasty, when many cultures intersected in China due to the Silk Road. Trade routes brought Persian Muslims, Indian sages, and Arab travelers through Chinese lands. Could it be that the statue was once a monument to Zulkifli, a prophet acknowledged by Islam and Judaism alike? A new theory emerged, that the Lesan monument was originally constructed by a multi-faith community that revered a common moral teacher. The similarities between the teachings of Buddha and those of Zulkifli were being scrutinized. Both taught patience, justice, detachment from worldly pleasures, and divine surrender. Could their stories have merged over time, or had they always been one and the same? As more evidence was revealed, Chinese Muslims began to feel a spiritual revival. In Urumqi, in Xinjiang province, a young Muslim teacher named Amina told her students, "What was hidden in stone is now clear in our hearts." She encouraged them to study not just Islam, but also the history of China through an Islamic lens. The mood in the Muslim world turned from curiosity to awe. Friday sermons across cities from Casablanca to Kuala Lumpur mentioned the Lesan discovery. Scholars began writing papers connecting Prophet Zulkifli's trials to Buddhist parables about renunciation and divine justice. But not everyone was pleased. Conservative voices in China's atheist circles began calling the discovery a foreign infection. Social media bots flooded the internet with conspiracy theories, calling the artifacts planted or fabricated. A few extremist monks accused the Muslim world of trying to erase Buddha. President Xi Jinping remained firm. "Let history speak," he declared on national television. "China is not afraid of truth. Truth is the bridge between civilizations." The world waited with bated breath for the upcoming Interfaith Symposium in Beijing. Meanwhile, deep inside the belly of the Lesan Buddha, the light from the inscriptions continued to glow, faint but undeniable. As the International Committee finalized its first report, Dr. Li closed the final page and looked up. "We came here to study stone," he said. "But we may have uncovered the soul of a forgotten prophet." The world had changed. And this was only the beginning. The anticipation surrounding the International Interfaith Symposium in Beijing reached fever pitch. World media outlets scrambled to secure live coverage. Never before had China hosted an event where Islamic scholars, Buddhist monks, Christian priests, Jewish rabbis, and even secular historians shared one stage, united by the mystery sealed inside a 1,000-year-old Buddha statue. The grand hall chosen for the symposium was the People's Great Assembly in Beijing. Banners bearing the phrase, "Truth, Tolerance, and Time," fluttered across the entrance, adorned with gold and deep red motifs. a blend of imperial elegance and modern diplomacy. Security was tight. Yet, the atmosphere buzzed with intellectual curiosity and spiritual anticipation. President Xi Jinping, dressed in a dark suit, opened the event with a speech that was both cautious and visionary. "We stand today," he said, "not at the crossroads of conflict, but at the gates of understanding. Let no discovery divide us. Let it unite us in the pursuit of knowledge and peace." The first speaker was Dr. Hafiz Idris from Malaysia. Standing confidently, he recounted the Quranic descriptions of Prophet Zulkifli, his patience, his silence amidst trials, and his spiritual devotion. "This is not about converting beliefs," Dr. Idris emphasized. "It is about reclaiming shared truths buried beneath the politics of time." Then came Venerable Tenzin Rinpoche, a Buddhist monk from Tibet. He spoke calmly but firmly. "I acknowledge the inscriptions. I see their presence. But to me, the Buddha is not a name. He is a path. Perhaps Zulkifli was also on this path. If the teachings are similar, maybe the goal is not so far apart." The crowd murmured with appreciation. Then came a surprise. Dr. Antoine Bellamy, a French agnostic historian known for his sharp critiques of religious mythology, took the stage. "What I find here is not mythology," he said. "I find archaeological alignment. Script, carbon dating, cultural overlap, all suggest a religious coexistence in early Chinese civilization. If this statue once belonged to another spiritual memory, the question is, why was it erased?" The audience fell silent. Outside the symposium, however, ideological battles raged. Social media was a war zone. Chinese internet forums saw an explosion of nationalist sentiment. "Do not rewrite our heritage," some wrote. Others responded, "The truth cannot be silenced." Muslim netizens from Pakistan, Indonesia, and the Arab world posted side-by-side comparisons of Quranic verses and Buddhist parables, emphasizing their overlap in ethics and spirituality. In the streets of Lausanne, people began gathering. Not in protest, but in silent awe. Candlelit vigils were held by local Muslims. Some Buddhist monks stood beside them, acknowledging the weight of the moment, even if they didn't agree on its interpretation. But behind the scenes, Chinese government officials grew nervous. The Ministry of Culture received warnings from party hardliners. "If this continues, Buddhism may be seen as subordinate to Islam," they warned. "We cannot allow social upheaval." President Xi was at a crossroads. For weeks, he had allowed academic freedom to thrive, encouraged exploration, and even championed dialogue. But now, his own circle was pressuring him to limit the growing narrative. He summoned Dr. Li Jun to the capital. The archaeologist, still weathered from weeks inside the statue's chamber, sat before the most powerful man in China. She placed a file on the table. It was the final research draft. "Is it all true?" she asked quietly. Dr. Li nodded. "Every word. We verified it with scholars from 7 countries." She leaned back. "Do you understand what this could mean?" Dr. Li hesitated. "Yes. And I also understand what it could heal." She studied him for a long moment. Then he made his decision. "We won't censor the findings," he said. "But we will frame them as part of a shared human journey, not a religious claim." Dr. Li nodded. It was a compromise, but a significant one. Meanwhile, more evidence continued to pour in. Laser scanning revealed that the giant Buddha's earlobes had once contained smaller carvings, since eroded, but they resembled ancient Semitic script. A closer study of the statue's base revealed stone tiles engraved with names, some unmistakably Arabic. Yusuf. Ibrahim. Zulkifli. Some tiles had been chiseled off in ancient times. A researcher from Iran theorized that during early dynasties, religious symbols might have been covered or overwritten during a wave of Buddhist consolidation. A young Muslim woman from Morocco, Dr. Amal Sufi, submitted her report. "What we are seeing is not an Islamic takeover of Buddhism. We are witnessing the fossilized memory of religious collaboration." She received a standing ovation during her speech at the symposium. Back in Lausanne, the locals began to profit from the increased interest. Hotels filled with tourists. Vendors began selling Arabic-inscribed souvenirs. Even non-Muslim visitors asked about the Prophet in the statue. Some saw a business opportunity. Others felt they were walking on sacred ground. Meanwhile, Chinese Muslims, often a marginalized community, saw this as their moment. In mosques across China, imams gave khutbahs, sermons, about Zulkifli's patience, linking it to the Muslim community's struggles and hopes. In Xinjiang, despite tensions, underground gatherings discussed the discovery. One Uyghur youth wrote anonymously online, "The Buddha held our names inside him. Now we are no longer invisible." However, warnings loomed. A firebrand Buddhist group from Sri Lanka issued a statement rejecting the discovery as a heretical rewriting of sacred history. Some monks burned effigies of the statue, claiming it had been desecrated. The International Committee, in response, urged patience and understanding. Dr. Hafiz Idris, in his final remarks at the Beijing conference, addressed the world directly. "To our Buddhist brothers and sisters," he said, "we do not seek to replace your wisdom. We seek only to understand our own roots better." And to the world, he continued, "Let this statue teach us that buried beneath centuries of stone is always a shared truth, waiting for us to uncover it, if we dare." As he stepped down from the podium, the audience erupted in applause, except for a few stiff faces from state officials. Later that night, in a quiet private moment, President Xi walked the halls of the National Museum. He paused before an exhibit of ancient trade maps. Silk Road routes sprawled across glass panels, linking Mecca to Xi'an, Baghdad to Leshan. He murmured, "Perhaps they came earlier than we thought." The wind outside howled through the old trees of Beijing. Somewhere, a call to prayer echoed faintly from a hidden corner of the city. History was speaking. The world had begun to listen. While the symposium in Beijing had come to a close, its ripples had only begun to spread. Across continents, religious scholars, historians, and common people were now grappling with the implications of the Leshan discovery. News anchors discussed it nightly. University students debated its meaning in classrooms. And in households across the Muslim world, parents told their children. Even a giant stone bore witness to the truth of Islam. In Istanbul, a special program aired on TRT World titled Buddha, Zulkifli, and the Lost Pages of History. Viewers watched clips from the symposium, saw the Arabic carvings inside the statue, and heard Chinese scholars confirm what had once seemed impossible. A Turkish historian, Dr. Eileen Demir, concluded the segment with a bold claim. "This may be the strongest archaeological indication that Islamic teachings spread deeper into East Asia than we ever documented." At Al-Azhar University in Cairo, students requested new electives on Islam and the Silk Road. In Indonesia, Islamic boarding schools held special sessions on Prophet Zulkifli, connecting his character with the Buddhist values of patience, balance, and spiritual solitude. For the first time, many Muslims around the world felt a strange connection, not conflict, with Buddhism. But within China, the government began to feel a quiet pressure mounting beneath the surface. In Leshan, where the discovery had first taken place, massive crowds began arriving daily. Pilgrims, tourists, and curious minds stood shoulder to shoulder. Many Muslims performed voluntary salah, prayer, near the river bank across from the statue. Some recited Surah Al-Anbiya, where Zulkifli is mentioned, with tears in their eyes. "We never imagined we'd pray here," whispered one Indonesian pilgrim. "But when I bowed, it felt like history itself bowed with me." Meanwhile, Xi Jinping received an updated intelligence report. According to internal analysis, interest in Islam had increased 700% on Chinese search engines. Arabic learning apps had spiked in downloads. Underground masjids reported a quiet increase in attendance, especially by Han Chinese youth. The Communist Party feared that the narrative of national unity could be hijacked by ideological resurgence. Conservative officials advised clamping down. Yet, she was caught between two forces, control and curiosity. In a private discussion with his cultural advisors, she said, "We cannot fear knowledge, but we must manage it wisely." To preserve stability, he issued a controlled media strategy. All official coverage would refer to Zulkifli as a Middle Eastern sage, rather than Islamic prophet. Any mass religious gathering near Leshan would be quietly dispersed for safety. However, academic research on the statue would remain open and even encouraged, to prevent accusations of censorship. At the same time, something unexpected was taking shape. Interfaith initiatives sparked across Asia. In Singapore, Buddhist and Muslim leaders held a joint conference titled Silent Prophets Shared Light. In Malaysia, young Buddhists visited mosques during Friday prayers in a gesture of peace. The idea that two major world religions might have intersected not only philosophically but historically was beginning to open hearts. Still, there were challenges. In Myanmar, nationalist monks condemned the discovery, calling it Islamic revisionism. Violent protests broke out in parts of Sri Lanka. Even in India, where communal tensions run deep, far-right groups claimed the discovery was fake propaganda from Islamic countries. Meanwhile, in the West, the narrative was carefully observed. In Washington, D.C., a special session at the Smithsonian brought together American archaeologists, religious historians, and political analysts. Their conclusion was measured: the discovery was real, the inscriptions authentic, but the meaning, they insisted, remains subject to cultural interpretation. But one voice stood out. A Jewish scholar, Dr. Rachel Levine, took the microphone and said, "As a student of the Abrahamic prophets, I recognize the name Zulkifli as Ezekiel in Hebrew tradition. If this monument connects to him, then perhaps this statue is a symbol of universal prophecy, not of one religion, but of divine continuity." Her words were met with stunned applause. Back in China, something was quietly brewing among the youth. Videos on Douyin, Chinese TikTok, began circulating, clips of young Han boys reciting the Shahida in secret, young girls wearing subtle headscarves in solidarity with Muslim classmates, and students sketching Arabic calligraphy on their notebooks. Many of these videos were deleted within hours, but the seed had been planted. In an elite university in Beijing, a student named Zhang Wei uploaded a short but powerful poem. The statue hid the name in silence, but the stone remembered the light. 1,000 years it watched and waited, until the world was ready to recite. The poem went viral. Outside the spotlight, underground Muslim communities across China, particularly among the Hui and Uyghur populations, felt emboldened. For decades, they had worshipped in secrecy or under pressure. Now, they whispered, Allah gave us a sign. In one underground masjid in Gansu province, an elderly imam wept as he recited Surah Sad aloud, tears streaming as he reached the verse. And remember Ismail, Elisha, and Zulkifli, all were among the best. Qur'an 38:48. Young men around him bowed in sujud, not just in worship, but in awe. The Leshan discovery had become a spiritual awakening. Even outside the Muslim world, an unexpected shift was taking place. Buddhist scholars began studying Islamic texts. A monk from Kyoto named Kenji Takamura began translating Quranic verses into poetic Japanese form. He told a BBC reporter, "If Zulkifli and Buddha share a soul, I want to hear both sides of his wisdom." By now, the original team of archaeologists, Dr. Li Jun and his colleagues, had become international celebrities. Documentaries were being made. Interviews aired daily. Dr. Li, however, avoided public politics. In one rare interview he said only, "The stone spoke. We listened. The meaning belongs to everyone." But that was not the end. In a locked vault under Beijing's National Research Institute, newly decoded scrolls from the chamber revealed something even more astonishing: a map. Hand-drawn, faded yet unmistakable, a trade route spanning from Arabia through Persia, into Kashgar, and ending in the Sichuan region. Beside it, a note in Arabic. "We brought his name to the east, so it would rise with the sun." Dr. Amal Sufi, upon translating it, burst into tears. She looked at President Xi's appointed advisor and said, "It was deliberate. They didn't stumble here. They came to plant his name." The revelation stunned the remaining skeptics. It was no longer just about artifacts, it was about intention. The presence of Islam in ancient China wasn't a possibility. It was a reality. And now, the world had to decide what to do with it. The discovery of the faded map within the chamber of the Leshan Buddha transformed the entire investigation from speculative archaeology into undeniable historical truth. With its jagged lines and carefully inked cities, the map traced an ancient route from the Arabian Peninsula, through the heart of Persia, passing through Samarkand, Kashgar, and finally ending in Sichuan, China, right where the Leshan statue stood. But it was the final note, delicately written in Arabic, that carried the weight of centuries. We brought his name to the east, so it would rise with the sun. It was no longer conjecture. This wasn't just a monument with Islamic symbols. This was a destination. A mission. The chamber within the statue had not just preserved relics, it had preserved intention. This was Dawa, spiritual outreach, etched into the mountains of China 1,000 years before modern historians thought possible. President Xi Jinping held the scroll in his hands during a private viewing at the Central Archives. He didn't speak for several minutes. The room, filled with advisors and senior historians, remained silent. Finally, he placed it gently on the velvet-covered table and said, "If this map is real, then we have never fully understood our past." The scroll was immediately sent for international verification. A team of experts from Oxford, Cairo, and Istanbul confirmed that the ink composition and calligraphy style matched early 9th century Islamic manuscripts. The map was genuine. And now, the geopolitical implications were too vast to ignore. The Chinese government faced a dilemma: suppress the map and lose credibility, or embrace it and risk ideological instability. Ultimately, Xi Jinping made a bold decision. He approved a cultural project titled the Eastern Light Initiative, officially recognizing the map as part of China's shared civilizations archive. In his televised address, Xi said, "Our land has always been one of meeting points. Silk, spices, teachings, they all came. The map found inside the Leshan monument proves that China was not isolated from the message of peace brought by distant messengers. Let us respect the journey, not fear it." Muslim countries hailed this as historic. Turkish President Erdogan called it a turning point in East-West religious understanding. Scholars from Al-Azhar sent a delegation to personally thank the Chinese government. And in Mecca, during Friday prayer, the Grand Mufti mentioned the Leshan discovery as a sign of Allah's wisdom, that no message is ever truly lost. But while Muslim-majority nations embraced the news, others remained cautious. In Japan, a group of Buddhist historians argued that Zulkifli might have been a wandering spiritual teacher whose teachings eventually merged with Siddhartha Gautama's. In Sri Lanka and Myanmar, nationalist Buddhist movements dismissed the discovery entirely, accusing China of politicizing faith. Yet what the critics couldn't stop was the growing spiritual awakening. Thousands of people, Muslims and non-Muslims, began making pilgrimages to Leshan. The local airport saw a 400% increase in international flights. Hotels were fully booked for months. The government had to establish crowd control units and guided tours. And deep within the belly of the statue, the Chamber of Unity, as it was now called, became a symbol of humanity's forgotten harmony. It was no longer just about Islam or Buddhism. It was about what connected them both. Journalists from all over the world descended upon the site. One American correspondent wrote, "In a time when the world is polarized by religion and culture, this statue, with its ancient Arabic inscriptions and Islamic relics hidden within Buddhist serenity, reminds us that perhaps we were never truly divided, we were just unaware." Meanwhile, the academic community launched new cross-disciplinary programs. Harvard, Oxford, and the University of Malaya began offering courses titled Prophetic Paths in the East. Documentaries began appearing on Netflix and Amazon Prime. Even Hollywood producers began inquiring about film rights. But away from the headlines, something more profound was happening. In rural parts of China, young Muslims began holding storytelling circles. Elders shared tales passed down for generations about a man of silence who came from the West, who spoke little but helped the poor, fasted through hardship, and walked barefoot into China's inner valleys. For years, these were dismissed as folklore. Now, they were seen as oral testimonies. In one small village in Gansu province, an 83-year-old Hui Muslim named Ma Yun stood outside a simple masjid and said to a foreign journalist, "When I was a boy, my grandfather told me that we had a visitor long ago, a holy man. He said his name was Zulkifli. We never had proof. Until now." His eyes filled with tears. But not all reactions were of peace and wonder. Extremist groups from various religious and political ideologies began using the discovery for their own agendas. Conspiracy theories spread online, accusing China of fabricating the evidence to gain favor in the Muslim world. Others claimed the relics were planted. A few ultranationalist groups in China accused the government of betraying ancestral heritage. To combat misinformation, the Chinese government invited global religious leaders to inspect the chamber themselves. Imams from Medina, monks from Thailand, and professors from Jerusalem walked together through the dark stone corridor inside the statue, reading the same inscriptions, examining the same beads, and witnessing the map with their own eyes. The moment was immortalized in a now iconic photograph: a Chinese Muslim cleric, a Thai monk, and a Jewish rabbi standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the carved word Zulkifli, glowing in ultraviolet light. Social media lit up. This is what the world should look like. One chamber. One truth. Many hearts. Back in Beijing, a more delicate discussion was unfolding. The Chinese government had received a classified intelligence brief warning that certain radical elements, both atheist and extremist religious groups, were planning to disrupt the Leshan site. President Xi, known for his hardline approach to domestic security, issued a simple but stern command. Let no one disturb the message inside the mountain. Guard it, not because it belongs to China, but because it belongs to all humanity. And so, the Leshan Buddha was now more than a monument. It was a symbol. A bridge. A silent witness to a forgotten past. A vessel carrying the names of prophets across time, across rivers, and across belief systems. The sun rose again over the rivers that morning, its golden light catching on the statue's face. And perhaps, just perhaps, for the first time in 1,000 years, the Buddha smiled, not as a religious icon, but as a keeper of memory. And in mosques around the world, the name of Zulkifli echoed once more. In the shadow of the Leshan giant Buddha, the world was slowly redefining its relationship with the past. Once seen only as a Buddhist marvel carved into stone, the statue had now become a living conversation, an eternal question whispered by the mountain. Who walked here before we named him Buddha? The world's eyes were still fixed on Sichuan. For weeks, the crowd outside the site had grown larger, not rowdy, but reverent. Men and women from every faith stood together. Some wore hijabs, others saffron robes, others suits or jeans. They came not to convert, but to understand. Journalists called it the New Jerusalem. Historians called it the soft revolution of the spirit. Inside the tightly protected chamber, scientists continued their analysis. The chamber was now regulated by controlled humidity, and infrared scanning equipment lined the walls. Chinese archaeologist Dr. Li Jun stood with Turkish scholar Dr. Sabiha Aslan, peering at a set of faint lines under new spectral light. Look at this, Sabiha whispered. It's a line from Surah Sad. Same calligraphic hand as the others. Dr. Li tilted his head. The Prophet Zulkifli, among the righteous. Again. Again and again. Sabiha nodded. It's not an accident. This was devotion. The writing confirmed what the map had hinted at. This chamber had not been hidden by nature or time, it had been intentionally sealed. Preserved. The theory now accepted among most of the international committee was as follows. Around 1,200 years ago, traveling Muslim sages, possibly linked to the Abbasid Caliphate, had made their way along the Silk Road, spreading the message of Islam. Somewhere along the journey, a group settled in China and began building a monument to honor one of the lesser-known yet spiritually profound prophets, Zulkifli. Whether they constructed the entire statue or carved the chamber into an existing structure remained uncertain. But the evidence was overwhelming. They had left their message, their worship, and their reverence behind, hoping it would one day be found. And it had been. But while reverence filled the mountain, tension filled the cities. In Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, underground chatter increased. Students whispered about converting. Young intellectuals formed reading clubs to discuss the Qur'an, studying it side by side with the Tao Te Ching and Buddhist sutras. Many were fascinated not just by theology, but by what they called spiritual symmetry. One quote from a Chinese university student went viral. "When the East prays with the hands open, and the West does the same, maybe the sky is not so different." Despite its controlled media policies, the Chinese government found itself facing a cultural phenomenon it could not contain. And so, it adjusted. The Ministry of Education issued guidelines allowing the mention of Islamic historical influence in public universities, while still labeling it cross-cultural heritage. Meanwhile, back in Leshan, something remarkable occurred. A young Chinese Muslim girl named Aisha, born into a quiet Hui family, stood at the gates of the statue. She had memorized the Qur'an by the age of 10 and dreamed of visiting the site ever since the news broke. Her father, a former truck driver, had saved for months to bring her. She stood quietly, clutching a small notebook where she had drawn images of Zulkifli based on what she imagined, a humble man with a staff, praying in the rain. When she finally entered the guided path around the statue's outer rim, she saw the massive stone eyes above her, calm, peaceful, eternal. "Baba," she whispered, "do you think the Prophet saw this view too?" Her father placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "If not with his eyes, then with his spirit." Later that night, a photo of Aisha praying outside the statue was uploaded online. Her small hands raised in dua, the silhouette of the giant Buddha glowing behind her in the twilight. The image was shared millions of times. Commentators around the world called it the picture of the century. Meanwhile, political ripples began to extend beyond China. In Saudi Arabia, the discovery sparked renewed interest in early Islamic outreach to the Far East. Riyadh announced a new research grant dedicated to tracing the travels of the Prophet Zulkifli. Iranian and Turkish scholars offered to fund restoration projects in Leshan to preserve the chamber. However, not everyone was pleased. In Sri Lanka and Myanmar, extremist Buddhist groups accused China of selling its soul. They claimed the entire discovery was an orchestrated political campaign to strengthen China's ties with Muslim nations. In response, China invited independent investigators from the United Nations to inspect the site. They came. They confirmed. And they left, stating simply, "This is not politics. This is history." Back in Cairo, Al-Azhar University issued a fatwa confirming the compatibility of Buddhist teachings of detachment and patience with Islamic spiritual values, especially those exemplified by Zulkifli. It was a small gesture, but one that signaled a new chapter of religious reconciliation. Even the Vatican, though cautious, sent a delegation to Leshan. One priest, after seeing the inscriptions firsthand, simply said, "Perhaps the stone speaks the same truth we all seek, in different tongues." The world was beginning to breathe again. In mosques across China, imams began incorporating stories of Zulkifli into Friday sermons. They reminded congregants that patience was his path, that justice was his duty, and that silence could be stronger than speech. And in Buddhist temples, some monks lit incense in silent acknowledgement, not of theological agreement, but of shared awe. Then came the moment no one expected. In the final stages of their excavation, archaeologists found what appeared to be a sealed compartment beneath the central altar. Using non-invasive drilling, they opened it, and found a scroll, perfectly preserved. The writing inside was breathtaking. In Arabic calligraphy with Chinese annotations it read, "We testify that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is his messenger. We built this not to conquer, but to remember. For Zulkifli walked in patience here, and we honor him with stone and silence. If you find this, know that we came in peace." It was signed only with a symbol, 2 palms raised in prayer. The world stopped. In Mecca, the Grand Imam wept on live television. In Turkey, the call to prayer was broadcast with a special message of unity. In China, even the secular elite could not dismiss the clarity of the words. Xi Jinping read the scroll himself. For the first time, he addressed the discovery not as a political leader, but as a man moved by the weight of truth. We do not erase our history. We uncover it. And in doing so, we find something more than stone. We find the soul. By now, the Leshan Buddha was no longer a tourist site. It was a sacred mountain. Not because of conversion. Not because of conquest. But because, for the first time in centuries, the world was listening to the whisper of the prophets hidden in stone. The final revelation, the scroll hidden beneath the altar inside the Leshan Buddha, sent waves across the world that no government, religious institution, or skeptic could contain. The message was clear, pure, and beyond political manipulation. It wasn't written to convert, to divide, or to dominate. It was a testimony, a 1,000-year-old whisper that had waited silently within stone until the world was ready to listen. We testify that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is his messenger. We built this not to conquer, but to remember. For Zulkifli walked in patience here, and we honor him with stone and silence. If you find this, know that we came in peace. Those final words, "We came in peace," became a global slogan for interfaith harmony. They were printed on shirts, engraved on commemorative plaques, and projected onto buildings from Istanbul to Jakarta. But more than that, they ignited an awakening, not just among Muslims, but among seekers of truth in every corner of the globe. In Leshan, the site was officially renamed by the Chinese government as the Valley of Unity, a gesture approved by President Xi Jinping after intense deliberation. He gave a speech beneath the towering figure of the Buddha, not as a commander, but as a guardian of heritage. We do not ask you to believe what you do not. We ask you to witness what has been revealed. This land has always welcomed travelers. Today, it welcomes the past. The Chinese Communist Party, known for suppressing religion, had now become the unlikely custodian of the greatest spiritual discovery in modern history. And they were careful in how they managed it. A new protocol was issued. The site would remain open to all faiths. No group could claim it exclusively. The chamber would be accessible only through guided tours under international supervision. What had begun as a political risk had turned into a diplomatic masterpiece. China was now seen as a leader in spiritual diplomacy. In the Muslim world, the response was nothing short of overwhelming. Millions began researching the life of Prophet Zulkifli. In mosques from Nigeria to New York, entire khutbah series were dedicated to his example. Children were named Zulkifli in record numbers. Books were published, documentaries streamed, and scholars gathered to re-examine everything they knew about Islam's Eastern journey. But the most beautiful transformation happened in the hearts of the ordinary. In Tokyo, a Buddhist woman visited a mosque for the first time. She told the imam, "I do not know your prayers yet. But I believe your prophet Zulkifli prayed like I do, quietly, with his heart." In Morocco, a Christian professor gave a lecture titled, "The Buddha Who Remembered the One God." And in rural Pakistan, an old man sat with his grandson beneath a tree and said, "The world looked east for silk and spices. But Allah sent them something more valuable, a prophet's shadow carved in stone." Meanwhile, in China, thousands quietly embraced Islam. They did not make noise. There were no rallies, no grand announcements. Just quiet shahadas whispered in homes, on mountain trails, and in university dorms. One such person was Zhang Wei, the young poet whose verses had earlier gone viral. She accepted Islam after visiting the Leshan site with her parents. Her father, a lifelong agnostic, stood beside her and said, "If stone can carry truth for 1,000 years, so can the heart of my daughter." Zhang Wei wrote a final poem that later appeared on a memorial plaque inside the Leshan chamber. They did not preach. They carved. Not on skin or scroll, but on mountain and time. And when we listened, the stone did not scream. It sighed. And the world changed. Internationally, countries began collaborating on new research. Saudi Arabia and China co-funded an institute for historical religious pathways. Malaysia introduced the Zulkifli Fellowship, a scholarship for interfaith scholars. Turkey announced plans to build a replica chamber for global visitors who could not travel to China. Even Pope Francis issued a statement from the Vatican. "We are all travelers on the same road, pausing at different mile markers. If a stone in China bears the name of a prophet we share, then we must stop and listen. Not to agree, but to understand." Yet amid celebration, there were still those who resisted. In some regions, radical groups claimed the discovery was a threat to their doctrines. In others, political figures feared a religious revival would destabilize secular ideologies. But their voices were drowned in a chorus of scholars, artists, monks, priests, rabbis, and imams who spoke with one voice. "This is not the time for fear. It is the time for truth." And in the spiritual realm, something deeper happened. People began to pray differently. Some Muslims, standing in Salah, imagined the chamber beneath the Buddha, with its ancient carvings glowing silently. Buddhists lit candles with the name Zulkifli written beside them. Jews studied Ezekiel with renewed awe, wondering if their prophet had traveled farther than history had ever told. Christians began to speak of lost prophets, whose light had never truly been extinguished. It was as if the Leshan statue had cracked open not just stone, but the vault of human memory. President Xi, reflecting on the legacy of this moment, authorized the construction of a global peace library near the site, where texts from every major faith and philosophy would be preserved together, without hierarchy. On its entrance, carved into white jade, would be the scroll's last line. "If you find this, know that we came in peace." And so, the final part of the story came not in words, but in silence. In the valley of Leshan, as the wind rustled through the trees and the sound of the river echoed between stone cliffs, the statue watched. Not with eyes of judgment, but with the serenity of one who had always known the truth, and had waited patiently for humanity to be ready. And at last we were. The sound of crashing waves filled the air, soft winds danced across the golden sands of Parang Tritis Beach in southern Yogyakarta. It was a calm morning, the kind that seemed to whisper stories waiting to unfold. Among the scattered tourists, one figure stood out, a tall, fair-skinned woman with light brown hair tied into a loose braid. Her name was Sarah Hilgers, a 28-year-old traveler from the Netherlands, seeking solace far from the bustling city life she'd grown used to. Sarah had always been a wanderer, but this trip was different. It wasn't just another escape. Something inside her felt empty, like she was running from a world she no longer understood. Heartbreak, stress, and unanswered questions about life had quietly pulled her toward Indonesia, to this serene coastline where time seemed to slow down. Wearing a floral sundress over her swimsuit, she walked barefoot along the shore, letting the ocean kiss her feet. The sea was unusually enticing that day, blue and wide open like a secret waiting to be told. Locals had warned tourists not to venture too far. The waters of Parang Tritis were infamous for their powerful undercurrents. But Sarah, lost in her thoughts, paid no mind. She ventured farther out, feeling the waves lap higher up her calves. The horizon stretched endlessly, and with each step she felt a strange thrill. But then, a sudden roar. A massive wave surged without warning, slamming into her body with fierce force. In an instant she lost her footing. Her scream was swallowed by the sea. Cold water pulled her under, and panic gripped her like a vice. She kicked and thrashed, her arms flailing as seawater flooded her lungs. There was no one nearby. The shoreline seemed distant. Her heart pounded violently as fear overtook her. And then, through blurry eyes, she caught a glimpse, a figure running fast, cutting through the sand. Arya Saputra, 32, a local lifeguard and member of the Coastal Rescue Unit, had been patrolling from a distance when he noticed the commotion. Without wasting a second, he sprinted. His training kicked in. No shoes, no hesitation. He dove headfirst into the churning sea, swimming with powerful strokes. The seconds felt like hours. He reached her just as her strength was fading. She was barely conscious, her limbs weak, her breath short. With one arm, he pulled her close, securing her firmly as he swam back toward the beach with determined urgency. They tumbled onto the sand, gasping. Sarah coughed violently, seawater spilling from her mouth. Her skin was pale, trembling from shock. Arya gently helped her sit up and wrapped his arms around her to keep her warm. He pulled out his phone and called for medical help immediately. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Sarah nodded faintly, still catching her breath. I couldn't swim," she whispered hoarsely. "I thought I was going to die." "You're safe now," Arya replied, offering her a calm, reassuring smile. "You're very lucky. The currents here are dangerous." Minutes later, an ambulance arrived, and Arya stayed by her side the entire ride to the nearest hospital. As they traveled in silence, something unspoken passed between them, an invisible thread. At the hospital, doctors treated Sarah for exhaustion and water inhalation. Nothing life-threatening, but she was told to rest. Arya waited outside her room, unsure why he hadn't left yet. Maybe it was duty. Or maybe something else. Later, when she was finally allowed visitors, Arya walked in with a bottle of water and a quiet smile. "I didn't get a chance to introduce myself earlier," he said, sitting beside her bed. "I'm Arya. I work with the Coastal Rescue Team." Sarah gave a small smile. "Sarah. From Amsterdam." Then, after a pause, "Thank you for saving me." They talked for a while, lightly at first. Where she was from. Why she came. Her love for quiet places. His life by the ocean. The conversation flowed gently, like the breeze outside the hospital windows. As the days passed and Sarah recovered, Arya continued to visit. He brought her local snacks, shared stories about Javanese legends, and even took her on a short walk around the hospital garden when she was strong enough. Their bond grew with every passing moment. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench beneath a frangipani tree, Sarah turned to him. "Do you believe things happen for a reason?" Arya looked thoughtful. "Yes. I believe Allah plans every moment, even the ones we don't understand." Sarah nodded slowly, her eyes distant. "I've never been religious. But lately, I've been wondering if there's more to life than just working, traveling, and running." Arya didn't push her. He simply listened. Over the next few days, they spent more time together. Sarah insisted on visiting the beach again, not to swim, but just to sit by the shore where it all began. Arya joined her. The sky was painted in hues of gold and lavender, and the sound of the waves was like a lullaby. "I feel like I owe you more than just my life," she whispered. "You owe me nothing," Arya replied gently. "But maybe this is the start of something." They shared a long look. It was no longer just gratitude. It was something deeper. Something neither of them could put into words, yet both felt in their bones. But behind that blooming connection was a silent wall either of them had touched yet: faith. Arya, a devout Muslim, had always known that love without shared belief could never blossom into marriage. Sarah, however, was still unaware of the storm waiting quietly beyond the horizon. The days following Sarah's recovery felt different. Every sunrise over Parang Triton's beach glowed a little warmer. The sea still roared with its wild waves, but inside Sarah, a strange stillness began to bloom, one that only deepened every time Arya smiled. They started seeing each other more regularly. Sometimes it was a quiet stroll along the beach, sometimes it was coffee in a modest cafe in Yogyakarta, where the locals played soft gamelan music and laughter drifted lazily through the air. Other times, they just sat in silence, gazing at the horizon like it held answers to questions they hadn't yet asked. Their bond deepened fast, but gently. There was no need for grand declarations. It was in the way Arya carried extra water bottles because Sarah often forgot. It was in how Sarah tried sambal for the first time just to impress him, even though it made her eyes water. But something hung quietly between them, something unsaid. One afternoon, as golden light spilled across their table at the cafe, Arya finally looked up from his glass of tea. His voice was calm, but serious. "Sarah, I've been thinking about us." Sarah froze for a moment. She had been thinking about them too. Constantly. Her dreams were filled with his voice, his kindness, his steadiness. "I know," she whispered. He took a deep breath. I'm a Muslim. And in our faith, marriage has certain conditions. I can't marry someone who isn't Muslim. Sarah looked away. She had expected this, feared it, even. But hearing it aloud made it real. I understand, she said quietly, her fingers tightening around her cup. I don't want you to feel like you're betraying your beliefs. I don't want to lose you, Arya added, almost in a whisper. But I also can't turn away from my religion. It's not something I follow casually. It's everything to me. Silence stretched between them, interrupted only by a soft breeze that moved through the open window. Sarah's heart pounded. The reality was clear, this was a wall. A wall no romantic feeling could climb without breaking something sacred. But instead of breaking down, Sarah looked into his eyes. What if I tried to understand it? Not just for you, but because I want to know. Arya blinked, stunned. You mean Islam? She nodded. I'm not saying I'll change overnight. I'm not even sure what it all means yet. But something about you, about the peace you carry, I want to know where that comes from. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, gently, he smiled. Not because she promised him love, but because she promised him sincerity. The following days marked the beginning of a journey neither of them had expected. Sarah began attending small Islamic classes with Arya's guidance. She started learning about the fundamentals of Islam, not just rituals, but the values, the purpose behind prayer, the meaning of submission, and the beauty of Tawhid. Every night she jotted down questions in a little notebook, questions about destiny, about God, about the soul. Arya never forced. He simply walked beside her, answering what he could and searching for answers when he couldn't. There were struggles. Some nights Sarah cried, overwhelmed by the changes, by the weight of leaving behind what she once knew. But in those moments Arya reminded her with the gentlest words. Even the moon learns to shine, little by little. And through that slow learning, a new love bloomed, a love not just for Arya, but for something greater. Then, one morning, Sarah stood at the entrance of a small mosque with her heart racing. Dressed modestly, her hair covered in a simple white scarf, she held Arya's hand tightly. Inside, a kind ustaz greeted her and guided her gently. The air was heavy with quiet reverence. And then she said it. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Her voice trembled, but her heart felt light. Tears streamed down her face, and Arya's too. She wasn't just someone he saved from drowning anymore. She was his partner in faith. Afterwards, as they stepped outside into the warm sunlight, Sarah turned to him with a smile that glowed from the inside. I feel like I've been found. Their wedding was small, quiet, and beautiful. No fancy halls. No grand gowns. Just a gathering of close friends and family in a modest space. Sarah wore a soft cream-colored dress and a hijab that framed her glowing face. Arya wore a simple white shirt and a wide, grateful smile. Their hands were joined. Vows exchanged. A quiet duo whispered. They weren't just man and wife. They were two souls bound by love, choice, and now shared belief. Later that night, as they sat under the stars on their porch, Sarah leaned her head on Arya's shoulder. I've given up a lot, she whispered. I know, he replied softly. But I've gained something I never imagined. They sat in silence, hearts full. But beyond the warmth of that night, they knew challenges still waited. Sarah's family in the Netherlands didn't understand her decision. Some friends drifted away. Some sent cold messages filled with confusion, even anger. And yet, Sarah remained firm. Every time she faltered, she remembered the wave that almost took her life. And the man who pulled her out. Not just from the ocean, but from the hollowness she once called home. Marriage brought joy, but it also brought reality. Sarah and Arya began their life in a small, cozy home on the outskirts of Yogyakarta. The house had simple wooden walls, a narrow porch shaded by leafy plants, and a quiet calm that suited them both. There were no luxuries, but there was peace. And yet peace didn't mean ease. Sarah now wore the hijab with quiet grace, walked to the local market with practiced modesty, and woke up at dawn to try and pray beside Arya, even if she sometimes stumbled through the Arabic words. The early days were filled with trial and error. She forgot steps in prayer, mispronounced phrases, and sometimes doubted herself. But Arya never once laughed. He encouraged her, gently corrected her, and reminded her that even the smallest effort was noticed by Allah. "It's not about perfection," he'd say. "It's about sincerity." Still, not all challenges came from within. Outside, people watched her closely. Some greeted her with kind curiosity. Others, with quiet suspicion. The whispers weren't always subtle. "Is she serious, or just following her husband? Will she really stay here?" Even Arya's own extended family was divided. At a family gathering weeks after the wedding, Sarah tried her best, smiling, helping with food, speaking what little Bahasa Indonesia she knew. But she could feel the unease in the room. The way some aunts avoided eye contact. The cautious tones. Later that evening, when they were alone, Arya found her sitting on the porch, her hands clenched in her lap. "I thought I was doing everything right," she said, her voice trembling. "But I still feel like I don't belong." Arya sat beside her and took her hand. "You do belong. Just not everyone sees it yet. But they will." She looked at him. "What if they never do? Then let's build a world where they're not the ones who decide." As the months passed, the couple slowly found their rhythm. Arya returned to work with the Parang Tritis search and rescue team. Long hours, unpredictable calls, but he loved it. Saving lives had become his purpose. Sarah, meanwhile, found purpose in learning. She began attending women's religious classes at a local mosque, joining community events, and volunteering at a children's center. Her Bahasa improved. Her faith deepened. One evening, after a tiring but fulfilling day at the center, Sarah sat across from Arya on their porch. The air was cool, and the stars above them shimmered like scattered pearls. "I want to do more," she said, sipping her tea. "Something that gives back to the people here. Something long-term." Arya looked at her with curiosity. "Like what?" "I don't know yet," she smiled. "But I'll figure it out." Then came the moment that changed everything again. One bright morning, Sarah held a small test strip in her hand, staring at the 2 pink lines with disbelief. Her heart raced. Tears welled in her eyes, not out of fear, but pure, overwhelming joy. She was pregnant. She waited until Arya returned from his shift that evening. He walked in, tired, sandy from the beach, and she met him at the door with a trembling smile. "What's wrong?" he asked, noticing her red eyes. Sarah handed him the test wordlessly. Arya stared at it. Then at her. Then back again. For a moment, the room was completely silent. Then he let out a laugh, half choked, half crying, and pulled her into his arms. "We're going to be parents," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Yes," she whispered back. "We are." Pregnancy brought a different kind of transformation. Sarah's days became slower, filled with rest, cravings, gentle walks, and endless advice from neighbors and friends. Arya became even more attentive, cooking when she felt tired, massaging her back at night, reading Qur'an softly beside her belly. But amidst the sweetness were moments of sadness too. There were times when Sarah longed for her own mother. For her family in Amsterdam, who still hadn't come to terms with her choices. Phone calls were short. Emails infrequent. There were no packages or congratulations. One evening she sat in bed, her hands resting on her stomach, and tears began to roll down her cheeks. "I wish they were here," she whispered. Arya pulled her close. "They will come around, Sarah. One day they'll see what you've built here. What kind of mother you've become." She nodded, wiping her face. "I hope so. I really do." The months rolled on, and with each passing week, their anticipation grew. Arya painted the nursery himself, pale blue walls, tiny stars across the ceiling. Sarah carefully folded baby clothes gifted by neighbors and friends. The community that once watched her with suspicion now embraced her. The woman from the West had become one of their own. Finally, on a golden morning in early spring, After hours of labor and prayers whispered between breaths, a healthy baby boy was born. They named him Adam. When Arya first held his son, he broke down completely. He kissed Sarah's forehead, whispering, "You've given me everything." Sarah, exhausted but glowing, smiled through tears. "No. We gave him life, together." Life with Adam brought new sleepless nights and endless wonder. His tiny hands. His gurgling laughter. The way he curled into Sarah's arms like he had always belonged there. In the quiet of those first days, as Sarah watched her husband rock their newborn under the soft yellow light of their room, she realized something powerful. This wasn't just the story of falling in love. It was the story of becoming love, day by day, struggle by struggle. And even though the road ahead would bring more unknowns, Sarah knew, in the depths of her heart, she had finally come home. Life with baby Adam was a whirlwind. Days blurred into nights. Cries turned into lullabies. The quiet house that once echoed with distant memories now pulsed with the heartbeat of new beginnings. Arya and Sarah had become parents, not just in title, but in every exhausted, joyful, tearful, awe-filled way. Sarah devoted her early months to motherhood. She stayed home with Adam, learning to interpret every cry, every tiny movement. Arya returned to his rescue duties but came home earlier than usual, never wanting to miss the smallest moments: Adam's first smile, his soft coos, the warmth of his weight on his chest. And yet, beneath the sweetness, a soft ache stirred in Sarah's heart. It was subtle at first, a passing thought when she saw an old family photo, a gentle sigh when Adam giggled in her arms. But over time, it grew louder. She missed her parents, her siblings, the streets of Amsterdam, the familiarity of Dutch phrases, the sound of her mother's voice on quiet mornings. One evening, while Adam lay sleeping, Sarah sat with Arya on the front porch. The sky was deep purple, stars just starting to emerge. "I wish my family could see him," she whispered. "To see how beautiful he is. How loved he is." Arya placed a hand on hers. "They will, one day." Sarah shook her head, her voice brittle. "I don't know if they'll ever accept what I've chosen." Arya didn't answer right away. He simply wrapped his arms around her and let her rest her head on his shoulder. "You don't have to be strong all the time, Sarah." "I know," she said softly. "But sometimes I don't know who to be anymore." Despite her sadness, Sarah continued to bloom. She joined parenting groups, some in English, others in broken Indonesian, that she was slowly mastering. The women around her began to embrace her, not as the foreigner, but as a sister, a mother, one of their own. But Sarah craved more than routine. She had once dreamed of shaping the world, not just surviving in it. One quiet afternoon, as Adam napped and the house bathed in golden light, Sarah opened her laptop. She scrolled through articles about social work, community development, and education programs in Indonesia. And something stirred. That night, over dinner, she looked up at Arya. "I want to go back to school." Arya paused mid-bite. "You mean college?" "Postgraduate," she said, her voice steady. "Social development or education. Something that lets me give back. I want Adam to see that his mother didn't stop growing." Arya stared at her in admiration. "You're incredible," he said. "If that's your dream, I'll support you with everything I have." And so, Sarah began a new journey. She enrolled in a local university offering a flexible postgraduate program. Juggling motherhood, marriage, and studies was never easy, but it gave her purpose. She studied at night, attended lectures with Adam sleeping in a sling on her chest, and wrote research papers during nap hours. Arya became her biggest cheerleader, taking over nighttime feedings, helping with assignments, and bringing her tea during study marathons. One day, after a particularly difficult seminar, Sarah sat outside the lecture hall, her face buried in her hands. She felt like giving up. Arya arrived minutes later, having sensed her struggle even through a text that simply said, "Tired." He crouched beside her, wiped the tears from her cheeks, and whispered, "No one said changing the world would be easy. But look how far you've come." Sarah looked up and smiled weakly. I just want to do something that matters. You already are, he said. You're raising a good boy. And now you're building something bigger. Months passed, and Sarah flourished. She presented research at a local conference on women's education. She started volunteering again, this time in rural communities where children didn't have access to basic schooling. Her name began to circulate, not as that Dutch woman who married a local, but as Sarah Hilger Saputra, a change maker with a fire in her heart and sincerity in her voice. Then one night, as they watched Adam sleep, Sarah looked at Arya with a softness that only came from deep love. Do you ever feel like we're meant to do more? Arya smiled. I've been thinking the same thing. They talked long into the night, about the children Sarah had met in the villages, the lack of resources, the broken dreams. And then the idea was born, a community learning center. A place for underprivileged children. A space where education wasn't a privilege, but a right. With help from friends and local leaders, they found a small abandoned building on the edge of town. Arya spent his weekends repairing the roof, repainting the walls. Sarah gathered books, notebooks, and chalkboards. They called it Rumah Cahaya, the House of Light. At first, it was just 5 students. Then 10. Then 30. Mothers came asking for classes too. Even older men wanted literacy lessons. Sarah taught with Adam playing in the corner, crayons in hand. Arya organized transportation for village children. Their little family was no longer just a family. It was the heart of a growing community. One evening, as they stood outside the center, watching children laugh and study under dim lights, Sarah leaned into Arya's arms. We did this, she whispered. Arya nodded. With Allah's help. And your courage. But behind every joy, Sarah still carried a quiet ache. Adam was now 2 years old. He could say full sentences. He had Arya's eyes and Sarah's stubbornness. But he'd never met his grandparents. Not once. One morning, Sarah sat at the dining table, holding a letter from the Netherlands. Her hands shook. It was from her mother. Inside were a few words. I still don't understand your choices, but I see how happy you are. Maybe one day, we'll understand each other again. Love. Mama. Sarah cried. And for the first time in years, the ache in her chest felt lighter. 3 years had passed since that fateful day on Parang Tritas beach. And now, Sarah stood before a classroom of eager young minds, a whiteboard behind her and her heart full. She was no longer just a Dutch woman who had once drowned in the sea, she was now Sarah Hilger Saputra, a respected lecturer at a local university, a community leader, a mother, and a Muslim woman of deep faith. Her mornings were filled with lectures and lesson plans. Her afternoons were spent at Rumah Cahaya, the learning center she and Arya had built from the ground up. And her evenings? They belonged to her family. Adam, now nearly 4, had grown into a sharp and joyful little boy. He spoke both Indonesian and Dutch fluently, adored the ocean like his father, and asked endless questions like his mother. Arya continued his work with the rescue team, but had taken on a more strategic role, training new volunteers, helping build protocols, and offering seminars on coastal safety. He was still the same man who once jumped into the sea to save a stranger, but now, he was also known as the man who helped build an education movement alongside his wife. Together, they were a team, a family, and a story. One late afternoon, Sarah and Arya sat beneath a banyan tree behind their home, watching Adam chase butterflies in the tall grass. I still remember the moment I first saw you, Arya said, sipping his tea. In the hospital? Sarah grinned. No, he laughed. Gasping on the beach. You looked like you were about to punch the sea. They both laughed. But seriously, he added, I had no idea that moment would lead to this. Sarah looked around, their home, their son, the distant sound of children playing at the learning center. Neither did I, she said softly. I was just looking for peace. I found love. I found Allah. I found everything. They fell into a warm silence. Then Sarah said, I've been thinking. Maybe it's time to visit the Netherlands. Arya looked at her. You're ready? She nodded. My mom's letters are more open now. She asks about Adam. I think she wants to meet him. Arya smiled. Then let's go. Let her see what love really looks like. A few months later, they boarded a plane to Amsterdam. The city was cold, quiet, and unfamiliar after years in Indonesia. But Sarah walked its streets with Arya and Adam by her side, wearing her hijab with pride and purpose. Her parents' home was modest, just like she remembered. And when the door opened, there was a long pause, her mother staring at the son-in-law she'd never met, and the grandson she had only seen in photographs. Then, slowly, she stepped forward and placed a gentle hand on Adam's head. He looks like both of you, she said. Sarah smiled through tears. He has your eyes, Mom. Over the next few days, barriers softened. Conversations began. Her father still struggled with the idea of her conversion, but Arya's kindness and Adam's innocence melted even his silence. One evening, Sarah sat with her mother in the kitchen. I used to be angry, her mother admitted. Not because of your faith, but because I thought I lost you. Sarah reached out and held her hand. You didn't lose me, Mama. I found something, and I brought it with me. My family. My heart. Her mother nodded, eyes brimming. I see it now. Back in Indonesia, life returned to its rhythm. But something had shifted. Sarah felt lighter, more complete. There were no more pieces left behind. She had bridged two worlds, and built a home between them. One afternoon, a documentary crew visited Rumah Cahaya. They had heard of Sarah's story, a foreign woman who embraced Islam, married a local, and launched an educational revolution in a small Javanese town. They interviewed her in the same classroom where Adam now often doodled in the back. What's the secret to your success? The reporter asked. Sarah paused. It wasn't success I was chasing, she said. It was truth. And I found it in faith, in service, in love that asks nothing but gives everything. The clip went viral. Suddenly, Sarah and Arya were invited to speak at conferences, to share their journey with couples, educators, even faith groups. But fame never distracted them. They always returned home, back to their students, their son, their quiet porch. Because that's where their real joy lived. Years passed. Adam turned 8. Then 10. He excelled in school, loved science, and wanted to be a rescue diver like his father, but also a teacher like his mother. Rumah Cahaya expanded into 3 branches. More than 500 children across villages were now receiving free education. Sarah trained other women to lead, giving them the confidence to teach, to lead, to dream. One evening, as twilight painted the sky orange, Arya sat watching Sarah address a gathering of young teachers at the center. She wore a long maroon dress, her white hijab pinned with a delicate brooch, her voice calm but passionate. And Arya thought, she is the strongest woman I know. When she finished speaking, the teachers stood to applaud. Sarah spotted Arya in the back, smiled, and made her way over. You were amazing, he said, kissing her forehead. You think they'll do well? She asked. I think they'll change lives. Because you showed them how. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Arya surprised Sarah with a letter. It was handwritten, in soft cursive, sealed with a wax stamp like the old days. She opened it slowly. To the woman I once found half drowned on a beach. To the woman who became the ocean I could never stop swimming in. You didn't just change your life. You changed mine. You changed hundreds. Maybe thousands. And every night I pray. Ya Allah, thank you for sending her to me. Because through her, I understood the meaning of love. Arya. Tears rolled down Sarah's cheeks as she held the letter close to her chest. And in that moment, surrounded by the rustle of wind, the distant laughter of their son, and the quiet sunset over Yogyakarta, she whispered to herself, This is the life I was meant to live.